By the time winter settled over the Great Plains, the land was buried beneath a thick, unrelenting blanket of snow. But for one farmer, a simple yet ingenious solution kept his chickens alive through the darkest days when every other method had failed. Before we dive into this story, tell us where you're watching from, and if survival tales of grit and ingenuity speak to you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story might just outlast this one. The wind howled across the frozen plains, its bitter fingers slipping under door frames, through cracks in the walls, and into the bones of anyone unlucky enough to be caught outside. For most of the year, this land was a symbol of opportunity. But as the months wore on, the sun disappeared, leaving the sky a dull gray, and the earth, hardened from years of drought and the relentless winter, turned into a silent, barren stretch. Hank and his wife Clara had hoped for better. They had come to this part of Kansas with dreams of a farm that would one day provide enough for their 3 children, a small plot of land that would bloom under their sweat and care. But now, as the last days of 1932 closed in, they were fighting just to keep what little they had left: food, warmth, and hope. Hank had built a small chicken coop at the back of their property when they first arrived. It was nothing fancy, just enough to provide eggs for the family and maybe a few to sell in town. But now, as the cold seeped into every corner of their home, Hank realized that their chickens, like everything else on the farm, were on the verge of giving up. Without the eggs, their diet would become even more sparse. The promise of fresh meals, even simple ones like scrambled eggs, had been a lifeline. Yet the cold was unbearable. The chickens had stopped laying, and every morning Hank was forced to open the door to their coop, dreading the sight of frozen, shivering birds. They huddled together in the corner, too cold and miserable to move. But Hank knew there had to be a way. He thought back to the old stories his father used to tell him about the farmers who'd survived through the harshest winters. He had a feeling there was a trick, something simple, yet forgotten by most, that could make the difference. As the wind picked up again, Hank stood still for a moment, the lantern in his hand casting long, flickering shadows against the wooden walls. In that moment, he remembered a trick he had once seen when he was just a boy, the kind of trick that made all the difference between survival and surrender. Clara had always been the first to spot trouble. While Hank lost himself in the land, convinced that more sweat and work would fix it all, she kept her eyes on the little things: how much firewood they had left, the state of their winter clothes, and how the chickens were faring. Every morning she'd go out to the coop, wrap herself in a heavy woolen shawl, and check for eggs. But with each passing day, the results were the same: empty nests and cold, lifeless birds. Hank could see the frustration on her face. "Maybe it's time to let them go, Hank," Clara said one evening, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. She sat with her hands folded, her eyes lost in the flames. "We can't afford to feed them if they aren't laying. The kids need the food more than they do." Hank knew she was right. The food they had left would only last another few weeks, and every scrap of meat, every egg, every piece of bread was precious. But giving up on the chickens meant giving up on something important, a small piece of hope in a world that felt increasingly hopeless. That night, as he sat staring at the flickering light of the lantern in their small cabin, Hank remembered a trick his father had taught him long ago. It wasn't much, just a simple method to keep the chickens warm enough to lay through the worst of winter. His father had never called it anything special, just a simple way to protect the birds during the coldest months. It wasn't something people often talked about, especially not after the big storms came and people started focusing on surviving, not the little things that made survival bearable. But Hank remembered, and now it was all that stood between his family and a long, hungry winter. The next morning, Hank set to work. He grabbed a few scraps of wood from the barn and used his old lantern to light the way as he dug a small trench behind the coop. He would need to build a shelter, something that would provide warmth and protection from the bitter cold. It would be simple, just enough to shield the chickens from the freezing winds. Hank worked quietly, his hands steady despite the cold. It wasn't much, but it was something. As he placed the final boards in place, he knew there was no turning back. This would have to work. If not, the chickens, and possibly his family's survival, would be lost in the same way the land had been, slowly swallowed by the cold. The first snowstorm of January arrived early that year, burying the land beneath an oppressive weight of white. Hank could hear the wind howling through the cracks in the cabin's walls, rattling the door frames and shaking the windows. It felt like the earth itself was protesting against the lives that tried to claim it. Clara had long since retreated into the warmth of the fire, but Hank stood outside, staring into the flurry of snowflakes, his breath clouding in front of him. The trench was complete, and the shelter was built, but the chickens hadn't yet taken to it. They still huddled in their cold coop, barely moving, a few of them already showing signs of frostbite. The cold had taken more than their warmth. It had taken their spirit, too. Hank could feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, heavy as the snow that piled higher by the hour. It wasn't just the chickens he worried about anymore. It was his family. Every step he took on, this land, every decision he made, now seemed magnified by the winter's cruelty. Each passing hour, as the cold sunk deeper into the bones of the world, Hank wondered if they would make it through the season at all. It was Clara's voice, soft and steady, that pulled him from his thoughts. "Let's try something else," she suggested that evening after watching him pace restlessly by the fire. "Maybe they'll trust the shelter once we show them. Let's move them ourselves." It wasn't an idea Hank had entertained. He had been so fixated on fixing the shelter, on doing something, anything, that he hadn't thought about coaxing the birds into the warmth. It was an old method, simple, but it could work. Still, it felt like another gamble in a long string of them. The next morning, Hank bundled up in his thick wool coat, gathering the chickens one by one. The wind cut through him, sharp and biting as he worked. He placed each bird in the new shelter, gently setting them down on the hay and straw he'd scattered across the floor. Clara was beside him, her hands numb as she helped him carry the last of the hens to their temporary refuge. With each passing moment, Hank watched for any sign of change. The birds settled uneasily at first, their cold, frightened eyes darting around. But slowly, the warmth seemed to reach them. The shelter protected them from the wind, and the thick walls trapped just enough heat to ease the harshest of the cold. Hank lingered by the door, watching. Clara stood quietly beside him, her breath visible in the air. In the dim light of the day, the world seemed suspended, as if waiting for something to break the silence. But nothing did. The chickens stayed where they were, huddled together, yet slowly, a few began to move, scratching at the straw, pecking at the ground. And for the first time in what felt like months, Hank saw the smallest of glimmers of hope. "Maybe this is it," he said quietly, more to himself than to Clara. And for the first time in days, Clara smiled. The snow continued to fall in thick layers, obscuring the world around Hank's homestead. The barn was buried, the trees frozen solid, and the ground beneath their feet turned to slick ice. But inside the chicken shelter, something remarkable happened. The hens began to lay. It was small, a handful of eggs at first, but enough to bring a wave of relief to the family. Every morning, Clara would hurry out to the shelter with Hank, their breath coming in quick bursts as they hurried through the snow to gather the eggs. She'd bring them in, and Hank would light the lantern, his hands shaking as he placed the precious eggs on the small table by the fire. "Just enough for breakfast," he would say, though every time, the statement felt like a small victory. The chickens, once cold and lifeless, were now living again. Their combs were less pale, and their eyes had the faintest spark of life. Hank couldn't help but smile whenever he went out to check on them, the weight of the storm outside made lighter by the warmth inside the shelter. The simple trick had worked. It wasn't much, just a small space that trapped the warmth of the earth, but it was enough. And as the days stretched into weeks, the family found a strange rhythm in the chaos. The children stayed close to the fire, wrapped in thick blankets, reading books or playing simple games. Clara, ever the resourceful one, had begun rationing their supplies with an almost obsessive precision. They could survive off the little food they had just a bit longer, just until spring, but Hank's thoughts were always with the chickens. He'd go out each day, shovel in hand, and clear the snow around their shelter. He watched them like a father watches his children, with pride and concern. Every egg they laid seemed like an affirmation that they could keep going, that they weren't giving up. The land, however, wasn't as forgiving. The snow that covered it so heavily was just a precursor to more storms to come. In February, the cold reached new heights, dipping below zero for days on end. The family's firewood was beginning to dwindle, and the food stores were growing low. There was a sense of dread that hung in the air like a thick fog, a creeping fear that they might not make it much longer. But each day, Hank clung to the small victories. The chickens were alive, the family was still here, and for now, that had to be enough. The worst of the storm still lay ahead, but for the first time in a long while, Hank believed they might survive it. After all, survival wasn't just about what you had. It was about what you were willing to do to keep going. And Hank was willing to do whatever it took. By the time March arrived, the land had started to change in subtle ways. The days were still cold, and snow still draped the earth like a shroud. But there was a new feeling in the air one Hank hadn't expected. The biting winds had quieted slightly, and the sun, though still hidden by a thick veil of clouds, seemed to shine a little brighter. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. Inside their cabin, Clara continued to watch over the children, her movements methodical but steady, as though the rhythm of survival had become second nature. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, the warmth radiating through the room. Hank sat by the window, gazing out at the distant horizon where the snow-covered hills met the overcast sky. He had grown used to the silence, the oppressive stillness of the storm, and the quiet murmur of his own thoughts as he worked the land. But as much as he had come to appreciate the small victories, the eggs, the warmth, the protection they had built, it was clear to him now that survival was a delicate balance, one that could tip at any moment. Hank had always been a man of action, the type who would toil from dawn to dusk, his hands calloused and his body worn down by the work he set before him. But there were moments now when the work felt too much, when the weight of the winter felt too heavy on his shoulders. He had known hardship before, but this was different. This was a battle not just for food, or warmth, or shelter, but for hope itself. He rose from his seat and stepped outside, his boots crunching in the snow as he made his way to the chicken shelter. It had been a long time since he had felt anything other than the cold bite of the wind, but today the world seemed quieter, more still. He found himself staring at the chickens, their breath fogging in the air, their bodies huddled together for warmth. The shelter he had built was holding strong. The birds, once weak and stiff with the cold, now moved more freely. The straw beneath them had begun to soften, their eggs now plentiful enough to make it through the day. It wasn't just the shelter, it was his determination, the quiet strength he had drawn from the simple act of survival. The land hadn't won, not yet. As Hank watched the chickens, he thought about how far they had come. From the depths of that harsh, relentless winter, from the mocking laughter of neighbors who thought him foolish for building such a sturdy shelter, they had made it. He had made it. And somehow, in the face of all the odds, his family had made it through. He didn't know what the future held. The storms weren't over. In fact, there would be more to come before the thaw was complete. The land would continue to test them, to pull at their resolve. But for now, Hank allowed himself the smallest measure of peace, watching as the chickens pecked and clucked, moving about their little sanctuary. Clara appeared in the doorway, her breath visible in the cold air. She didn't say anything, but Hank could see the quiet pride in her eyes. She didn't need to speak, it was clear that they were in this together, each day forging their survival from the stubborn earth beneath their feet. She stepped outside, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. Together, they walked back to the cabin, their feet leaving prints in the snow. The world outside still felt endless and harsh, but as they entered the warmth of their home, Hank realized that it was no longer just about survival, it was about endurance. It was about making it through the darkest nights, finding light in the smallest moments. "Do you think it will ever end?" Clara asked, her voice quiet as they settled into their chairs by the fire. "The cold? The storms? All of it?" Hank thought for a moment before answering, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "I don't know," he said softly. "But I do know this, we're still here. And if we can survive this, then there's nothing else we can't face." Outside, the wind howled once again, fierce and relentless. But inside their cabin, amidst the warmth of the fire, there was peace. It was a peace born not of certainty, but of quiet strength. The world could rage on as it always would, but Hank and Clara would continue, one day at a time. They had no other choice. And for now, that was enough.